Morning, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. Thank you all once more for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. I'm here today with my colleagues, Debbie Levine, who is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes, who is our scribe. We're also joined by Phil Pettingill as well, who is the coordinator overseeing all three of the currently active EDAM working groups. And I'd also like to thank Kathleen Colbert as well, who is here today to present on behalf of Vistra Energy. The meetings for this specific working group are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific. As you know, participation details of which are available on the ISO's public calendar. And after I hand it off to Debbie to review the scope and timeline for folks, the agenda, as you can see, will then begin with Kathleen's presentation to discuss Vistra's foundational goals and transmission types for this working group, after which we plan on moving to the final topic for today, that of transmission commitment. And just a few reminders. As a courtesy, as you may know, this meeting is being recorded in MP4 format and will be posted shortly following the meeting on the webpage. And these working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we of course encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives throughout these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand virtually by pressing the raise hand icon, and you would press it again to exit the queue once you've made your question. Unless you happen to dial in separately by phone, in that case you would need to dial #2 to enter the queue. We will pause also for questions throughout. And as you also may know, stakeholders are welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. If you'd like to present, please submit a request to present using the link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. And all material, as a reminder, related to this working group is posted on the associated webpage, and also everything is located on the last slide for all the reference material. And with that, I'll hand it over to Debbie.
So much, Jimmy. Good morning. So we're going to continue today on the transmission commitment, transmission availability discussion. Just a reminder for everybody, the working groups are only looking at, well, this particular working group is looking at transmission commitment and then congestion rents. And once the working groups complete their process in March, what will happen is that the CAISO will take all this information and put it into an issue paper, and then it'll start the entire process of a stakeholder process. So this is not all of the discussions that are going to take place on forming EDAM. This is merely a work group that is trying to come up with the transmission commitments and then the congestion rents associated with that. So I want to make sure that everybody's, grounded in that this is not the end-all to be-all. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and we're trying to get stakeholder comments first on how to deal with transmission availability, timing, duration, and then congestion rents and unavailability of transmission. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Kathleen. What we're going to do is go ahead and allow her to give her presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So next slide, please. Next slide. There you go. All right, Kathleen, it's over to you.
Great, thank you, Deb, really appreciate it. I'll introduce myself again, but thank you, Jimmy, for doing so. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra Corp, and I'm the Director of Regulatory Policy in the West. We appreciate the opportunity to speak today and share some more context, I think, for some of the comments that we have been making during these working groups, and also give you a picture of what it is that we think is a workable path that deals with some of these stickier issues that I'm going to summarize. What I'm going to go through is give a little bit of context on why this is so important right now in our current regulatory landscape. Then I'm going to move on to foundational goals. What are we trying to do here? And really in light of transmission. So it is anchored in transmission. conversation. And then finally, really mapping out the transmission types and what that would look like. So with that, can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide. You can look at I like to include frequently used acronyms in my decks because if you're looking at it outside of a meeting, it's helpful. So thanks for that. And first, let me spill some context. And if you can go to the next slide, we should be on slide 5. Perfect. So there is some recent FERC precedent that is instructive on the effort that we're going through today. There's a few precedents, but one that we find instructive is the recent Southeast energy imbalance market, equivalent to SEAM market. While that did get passed through FERC, if y'all recall, it was a bit of a split bench at the time, and it passed by order of law rather than an actual decision by the commission. Commissioner Clements, so what we know is that at least one of the commissioners is very concerned about the substance in these types of filings. And I wanted to share just kind of 3 quotes to anchor us in why this is really critical to keep in mind that this is a regulatory risk that we need to ensure as we design that we have factored in and can show that we have contemplated these issues. The first thing that I note is that Clements noted that order number 888, or open access order, established a firm requirement of open access, not a demonstration that economic incentives might create conditions where utilities would choose of their own accord to permit open competition. What do we think, or what do we read into this that Commissioner Clements means? Is that a couple of the heartburns that she identified were that open access is not technically feasible because under the SEAM filing, because the filing parties did not design the market in a manner that facilitates a workable solution. They did not invest in the software or other analytical capabilities necessary to facilitate access under their chosen design. And permitting transmission obeyed open access requirements via their own market design choices and investment decisions would fundamentally undermine open access. She also noted a view that the filing parties' proposals violates this requirement to avoid undue discrimination because it established a select group of members with exclusive transmission-related rights, namely the ability to participate in controlling and overseeing the platform for administering service across a footprint comprised of many different transmission owners. We want to share this context because this is something that is coloring our participation in this effort. We want to avoid the risk of being at FERC and having concerns like these raised. And so we're very mindful that in this process, we need to ensure that there's open access to the transmission system. With that, let's move to the foundational goals. If we can move to slide 7, please. One more slide, please. Perfect. So what are some foundational principles that we propose should be considered? And a lot of these, I think, are things we may have touched on, but we're trying to provide maybe some more skeleton around it, more structure. So we believe that under EDAM, transmission providers that are EDAM members still need to maintain open access transmission tariffs that respect open access rules. EDAM transmission providers need to abide by the OAT limitations on using network service to make off-system sales and the requirement to undesignate network resources that are making economy energy sales. Put more maybe precisely, we view EDAM sales that do not serve the EDAM members' native load as the equivalent of an economy energy sale. As a result, EDAM members could arguably bring to EDAM the transmission service that is associated with network resources serving native and network load. We also think transmission capacity can be freed up. Transmission capacity freed up should be available on a non-discriminatory basis to both the EDAM and third-party transmission customers outside of EDAM. Transmission capacity could be freed up from one of 4 ways that we've contemplated to date. There may be others, and I encourage you to raise them during this conversation. But the 4 are undesignated network resources, donating point-to-point service, reselling point-to-point service, or unscheduled point-to-point service. Next slide, please. EDAM is not a regional transmission operator or an ISO, but a voluntary joint dispatch where there's a value proposition for all participants, not just load serving entities, to have a vested interest. What's that value proposition? EDAM, through a centrally cleared dispatch, can more effectively identify the least cost, security constrained set of resources that can achieve energy and/or AS needs across the footprint. We're looking to increase the efficiency of the fleet, which will drive EDAM benefits. The benefits only increase with ensuring open access to the market to entities outside the EDAM footprint and to all types of market participants inside the EDAM footprint, and preserving the ability of entities outside of EDAM to continue to access bilateral market opportunities. But kind of more in, I think, my language, and I would just have recap that as increasing liquidity by ensuring all market participants can participate will enhance the ability of EDAM to deliver the benefits that we're striving for. The other thing we want to note is EDAM is a complement to the existing daily transmission reservation window and/or the daily bilateral market activities. I want to emphasize EDAM is not a substitute. Activities will still occur in some fashion, even if this market goes live. EDAM will impact existing activities, and the design should address this by ensuring competition or access to mitigate any adverse impacts. EDAM entities should be able to decide which portions of its market activity it wants to open up to EDAM dispatch, consistent with this concept of it being a voluntary joint dispatch. Just to clarify, because I think there's been some confusion, what we understand the model would include the resource P node, the load nodes, and internal constraints and inter-die transfer capability at all times once set up. But the flexibility is needed to show that it is already being used outside the market. A big part of that, for example, supporting non-participating resources and allowing and implementing the new PreDay ahead ETAG process that we're recommending. Next slide. What are some open access concepts that must be addressed to ensure the EDAM framework supports competition? Couple questions, few of our thoughts on the answers. Curious what stakeholders think. Our first question is, can EDAM be designed to ensure open access to this complementary market and reservation option? Well, we think yes. We think allowing for these activities to occur through EDAM, in addition to bilateral markets and reservation processes, will improve EDAM efficiency and supportability of the market to produce efficient results through this increased liquidity. Some design elements that need to be included, though, so we do keep these as assumptions as we move into the transmission piece, is that intertie points need to be modeled at the EDAM BAA border. Non-EDAM BAA entities need to be able to register to participate in EDAM as either an internal third-party generator, intertie marketers, or sub-entities, and it should be able to support competitive retailers if they happen to exist in that area. Next question, can EDAM be designed to allow an EDAM BAA to identify which resources are non-participating versus participating resources? Well, we think yes. EDAM BAA should be able to undesignate network resources prior to the day-ahead market to allow for redispatch for the equivalent of economy energy purchases and receive the equivalent of secondary network service treatment for that. The EDAM BAA should be able to represent in the market through non-participating resource base points that these resources are serving a portion of its load and/or AS requirements. Last question, one we haven't really talked about, but I think is important, is should the EDAM BAAs or EIM, I think I code switched a bit here, apologies. EDAM BAAs have their tools that allow them to limit their participation in the EIM be made available to them in the day ahead? Well, I think it depends, but I want to list a few of them. First one, directly relevant to transmission, is it seems reasonable that an EIM LSC can choose to limit their transfers in EDAM. However, this makes it even more critical, even more important, that EDAM also optimize available transmission capacity and other participants' offers to allow for the ATC to be reserved through the market. On manual dispatches should they only be allowed in the real-time horizon under EDAM, or should they also be allowed in day ahead? Our inclination is we should anticipate a BAA might want to submit a manual dispatch under EDAM, not just under EIM, although that may not be as frequent. We should still design with it in mind. Post-contingency operations. For those who don't know, there's the ability to isolate post-contingency. This is not relevant in the day-ahead space, in our opinion. If we're missing anything, please let me know. There are some other tools, though, risk mitigation tools that are available in day ahead that might benefit EDAM entities. And I think with the spirit of expanding the day-ahead market, these would likely extend as well, as long as there's interest in it. Happy to share more if there's interest, but there's gas burn reports produced out of the D+1 process. They can be used for gas planning purposes. And there's also gas burn constraints that can be enforced in the day-ahead market. Next slide, please. So EDAM needs to be open, non-discriminatory, not unduly preferential to succeed as a concept. EDAM should allow for rights that should not be optimized to be scheduled prior to day ahead to identify the portion of the total transfer capability that is not accessible to the market. We need to allow participants to identify on an E-tag to submit intertie transactions as either participating or non-participating, depends on the situation, depending on whether they want to use their transmission rights to support participating offers, economic or sales schedules, or as a non-participating base point. All would have different priority levels. EDAM should add an intertie bidding at all BAA borders where any market participant that registers to be an intertie bidder can submit imports, exports, or wheels identified at a source point and sink point anywhere in the EDAM footprint. An important consideration here is EDAM should limit loop flow across non-EDAM transmission internal to a BAA to avoid schedules that could introduce real-time loop flow issues. Access should be prioritized based on pre-day ahead ETAG scheduling requirement, ETAG submitted prior to the day ahead market process runs. Prior reservations on an ETAG can be enforced as penalty prices on those intertie offers for any that are self-scheduled, consistent with transmission loading relief order, and I will give more details on that in the next section. If there is no prior reservation on an ETAG, then that intertie should receive the lowest priority treatment, equal to non-firm hourly. Finally, EDAM should extend energy imbalance market concept to the day-ahead market, the bubbles and straws. I think we've had some questions about that, but only for transmission being released or resold by any participant. The transmission owned, reserved, either released or resold by the LSC for serving its internal load needs through redispatch under EDAM is equivalent to economy purchases on the equivalent of secondary network service priority. Transmission owned, reserved by third party that is unscheduled or resold for EDAM optimization should be accessed by transfers or by intertie bidders on the equivalent of non-firm transmission. And since these awards are hourly out of day ahead, we recommend non-firm hourly. Next slide. Now we're going to kind of walk through what is one way to accomplish these foundational goals. First, we think that there needs to be a process that allows for competitive solicitation by the reliability coordinator, perhaps, of third-party or non-EDAM transmission rights at the EDAM interties, or even internal to the EDAM that's held by other third-party or non-EDAM entities. We've suggested maybe aligning this frequency with current durations for transmission products, yearly, monthly, weekly rights, and add a daily resale option in T-2 timeframe for the flexibility to only release a portion of the entire duration that may be owned or reserved. The transmission right holders can submit the offers into this competitive solicitation process, and a reliability coordinator, as a potential suggestion, determines whether the transmission would result in benefits above those offers. We may not need to pay congestion rents if the value is reflected in the offers, and I think this is something we're worth really getting into the details of when we are ready to have this discussion, I think at a later working group meeting in more detail. How do we compensate what is the right way to compensate for any transmission rights that are being bought through the competitive solicitation process. A second process that needs to be added is a process that does an advisory EDAM run to determine the network resources serving network loads and associated transmission. And when I say needs, obviously these are just suggestions. I should clarify, it needs to be added if the EDAM entities want to have an advisory result to identify which resources to undesignate. If you don't, then it doesn't need to be a process. But we're working with the assumption that that is something that the EDAM entities would want to see. We propose the D+2 results be made available in order to identify which resources could be undesignated. The LSEs can undesignate their network resources that they choose to based on this information, which would reduce the network integration transmission service and release the portion of NITs to EDAM. Third, another process that requires a pre-day ahead scheduling requirement. Transmission right holders that want to schedule on these rights through EDAM or to reserve these rights through EDAM may submit an ETAG with the transmission profile showing their higher priority reservation type. If no ETAG is submitted with the transmission reservation on it, it will be released as Nonfirm HourlyATC, unscheduled transmission capacity released. So if this process allows for the transmission right holders to reserve that capacity that they own within the EDAM construct, own or reserve, have reserved. Finally, the market functionality that enforces penalty prices on intertie bids in relative priority consistent with the priority order of the transmission profile's product type should be enforced in the markets. And I'll go through that in more detail in the next section. Next slide. Freed up transmission, secondary service non-firm HourlyATC from the three prior activities would be open to intertie transactions, imports, exports, wheels, and EDAM on an equal basis. Scheduled transmission would only be available to intertie bids where the ETAG with a firm reservation product type or non-firm product type with longer durations than daily is identified and used to prioritize the scheduling and curtailment priority. Third, transmission owned that is not resold to EDAM may need to have its rate of change managed such that any EDAM dispatches do not cause loop flow concerns or inappropriately use its transmission capacity. For example, do we need flow-based pass branch groups that need to be enforced in the model all the time to respect these thermal limits? Possibly, something that we've been thinking through. And what other considerations need to be considered for these types of transmission that have not been released? I think that's an open question to keep working through. Next slide. Now I'm going to move into the next section that's going to give some examples and put maybe some more terminology around those concepts that can achieve those foundational goals. Next slide. Thank you. Perfect. Transmission priority levels by type. Well, let's start with what the priority levels are for transmission reservation products, which you see here in green. Moving from the lowest priority, next hour market service, if that's offered, not everyone does. Priority 1, service over secondary receipt and delivery points. Priority 2 is what we start to, I think we generally are talking about more often, non-firm point-to-point hourly service. That is a lower priority than non-firm point-to-point daily service. Think shorter duration, lower priority. If you're not as familiar with the concept, it's a decent rule of thumb. That steps all the way down from daily, weekly, monthly, and then finally get to, and I bucket all of those into, priority 6 is network integration transmission service from sources not designated as network resources, the NN product type, and then finally priority 7, which is firm point-to-point transmission and network integration transmission service from designated resources. That's the highest priority treatment that's provided. So let's start at the top, the first two. Currently, we haven't identified any need for EDAM or EIM to include these types of transmission products. Starting with, now let's move to priority 2 through 5. Intertie awards associated with pre-scheduled non-firm reservations with longer durations depends on the tag code. So that pre-day ahead scheduling process that we are proposing would occur prior to the day ahead market process. The transmission profile on that ETAG would identify the code ND, NW, NM on it to identify if there is a longer duration reservation associated with this transaction. That can translate into penalty prices that can be enforced in the order of this priority. Now let's talk about priority 6. Under kind of current contract, purchases to serve internal load from economy energy would fall under this category. Last priority level, let's start with the firm point-to-point. On the left side, intertie awards associated with pre-scheduled firm reservations. Again, these can be enforced through the pre-day ahead scheduling, identifying that ETAG holds a transmission product profile that has the code F associated with it, and the intertie transaction that is associated with that ETAG that bids into the market can have the higher priority level on that sell schedule. There could also be a possibility to have an even stricter requirement through the idea of a base point, depending on the entity and depending on the type of market purchase we're talking about and how they would want to offer into the market. That transitions the other to the right side of the slide. So non-participating resources from designated network resources. The flexibility, as we mentioned earlier, should still exist for EDAM BAAs to identify, to still have the designated network resources and to be able to submit non-participating resources that have the highest priority through their base, I'm going to call them base points, that are submitted. And that there might be and that those priority levels should be aligned with the intertie transactions that have a firm priority level. Next slide. So how should we think about it differently with EDAM transactions under open access? So what I've done here is I've removed the transmission product that we looked at on the last slide, the first two, because we don't at this time see any need for those types of products to be supported through the market. And if it needs to be, please let us know. So in this world, our lowest priority would be start at non-firm point-to-point hourly service and then go down through the remaining products. So on the right, what I've added is red text shows what the EDAM complement is adding and what we need to kind of delve into probably in more detail. So for priority, the lowest priority, non-firm hourly, EDAM transfers and intertie awards with no ETAG would have this lowest priority associated with any self-schedules that are submitted. Priorities 1 through 3 would be the non-firm daily, non-firm weekly, non-firm monthly, that only the ones that have been pre-scheduled in that pre-day ahead scheduling process. Intertie awards could be submitted and associated with these pre-scheduled non-firm reservations with the longer durations. Depending on their tag, there would be 3 different priority levels depending on the duration, and have that priority level enforced through penalty prices to manage the loading on that line and any curtailment if the market identified the need to curtail. Moving to priority 4, network integration transmission service from sources not designated as DNR or designated network resources. I mentioned on the last slide, purchases to serve internal load from economy energy bilaterally would still potentially be there. But what does EDAM add? Internal generation dispatched within EDAM BAA to meet its load. We believe that this is the equivalent of secondary network service and should have the priority level of priority 4 within the EDAM construct. This is one that I think we definitely need to talk about in more detail. There's some nuance here. I'm going to leave the nuance and see if we have any Q&A. If we want to revisit it and have time, I'm happy to do so. Finally, on priority 5, on the point-to-point transmission side, again, still intertie awards associated pre-scheduled firm, and on the right, non-participating resources from designated network resources. What's in red here is what I think are really some of the interesting policy discussions that I believe we need to have in more detail. Next slide. Okay, so in the spirit of the buckets, in the spirit of bucketizing, I took a step back and was like, okay, can we make this simpler? Because, you know, I kind of like the precision of what we just talked about, but can we make it simpler? Sure. I did my best. So I would combine these into, I guess, 4 buckets. or categories. I'll start with the dark green one. So priority 0, non-firm, point-to-point hourly service. What types of transactions fit into this? EDAM transfers and intertie awards with no ETAG transmission shown can compete for non-firm hourly ATC. What do we need from, and I also, as we move across, the third column is, okay, what actions are needed, what information is needed from the EDAM BAA to do for this category? Well, the EDAM BAA should submit non-firm hourly ATC to the EDAM operator. So that's one input that we're receiving. The next category, priority 1 through 3, the non-firm point-to-point. These are the longer duration ones we discussed, non-firm daily, non-firm weekly, non-firm monthly. What transactions are associated with this category? Intertie offers can clear through economic signals or as self-schedules with penalty prices that go from lower to higher, from non-firm daily to non-firm monthly, where non-firm monthly is lower than the network, secondary network service equivalent, the NN product type. What kind of information do we need from, or what are the implications for the EDAM BAA and or the EDAM operator? Well, for this category, EDAM holds available transfer capability at the ties above the non-firm hourly ATC for the non-firm scheduled tags for the schedules that were submitted in that pre-day ahead scheduling process. The intertie transactions submitted associated with those tags would have the higher priority to clear and subscribe that transmission. Category 3. This is a network integration transmission service from sources not designated as network resources. Types of transactions associated with this category, participating resources internal to BAAs would be one of them through redispatch. There's also the possibility, I mean, this is really kind of the category of the transfers in my mind. What do we need from the EDAM BAA? The EDAM BAA would need to provide the amount of internal transmission capacity, the portion associated with its participating resources, identified to serve its load, that it's anticipated will serve its own load. Priority 5, firm treatment. This is for, so now I'm bucketing firm point-to-point, and then it's from designated network services. What types of transactions do I think we kind of envision associated with this? Non-participating resources include the designated network resources, and these can be submitted with base points, and intertie offers can also be submitted as economic or self-schedules. If self-scheduled, they would be prioritized consistent at the same level as the non-participating resources base points, since both of those have the same priority level under priority 5. So what's the implication, kind of some details on how EDAM, what would we need to think about for this category? Well, EDAM should hold available transfer capability at ties above all non-firm for firm scheduled tags for the schedules that have been submitted in those pre-day head scheduling process. The EDAM BAA provides the amount of internal transmission capacity to the CAISO, so the CAISO is aware of the amount accessible through EDAM redispatch. And that is also which you could think of as assuming the portion associated with non-participating would have that higher network integration transmission service already ascribed to it under the old rules. This, I believe, should be fairly self-explanatory, but happy to answer questions. Next slide. So let me just give a little bit more teeth on the pre-day ahead scheduling requirement, because I anticipated there'd be some who would be asking about where did this come from? This concept, to some extent, I think is, and maybe there's some variations with EDAM, but generally speaking, we're pulling this idea of a scheduling requirement out of the pro forma OAT. The pro forma OAT has a requirement: the schedules for transmission customers' firm point-to-point transmission service must be submitted to the transmission provider no later than 10 a.m. or a reasonable time that is generally accepted in the region and is consistently adhered to by the transmission provider of the day prior to commencement of such service. Our thinking on the pre-day ahead scheduling requirement is we need to talk about the timing. It needs to happen prior to some of these other processes we talked about the last meeting, so that any unscheduled rights can be released through non-firm hourly ATC calculations. But I think that we need to walk through the processes in more detail before we can propose a specific time. But the concept here is we, as a group, need to arrive to a reasonable time that we all generally accept is workable under the EDAM timelines in order to support this pre-day ahead scheduling requirement. We are proposing the pre-day ahead scheduling deadline for all EDAM BA, including the CISO, just to be super clear, allows for this ATC to be calculated such that the unscheduled rights are released. I just want to flag, it's a big open question on the timing. Does 9 a.m. Pacific give enough time to recalculate and provide EDAM operator that non-firm ATC value by 9:30? If it does not, then what is the amount of time after a scheduling requirement that the EDAM BA would need to calculate their non-firm hourly ATC for EDAM to use? Another open question is how will the internal transmission capacity be communicated in the pre-day ahead timeframe for use in EDAM on that equivalent of secondary network service? We anticipated probably aligned to this pre-day ahead scheduling requirement so that all entities have the same deadline for pre-day ahead scheduling to get the higher priority. But it's just an open question that we think we need to talk about when it comes to timing. And with that, Debbie, I think I made good on my promise to make it within 30 minutes, and I'm happy to open it up for questions, comments, anything.
Good. A couple of preliminary questions just to start out while people get an opportunity to raise their hand.
Sure.
Why do the 3 ahead day out scheduling at all? We don't need the information until 10 o'clock, and tagging isn't required until later in the afternoon after the market has come up with its results. So why incorporate a new 3-day out process?
So that's a great question, and I'm actually looking to see if I wrote 3-day out anywhere, because if I did, then
Or 2-day out.
2-day out, yeah. I think so. Thanks for asking. It's a 2-day out pre-day ahead scheduling process. I'll just throw out a couple times that I think we were thinking of as e-tags would be required to be submitted 8 a.m. the day on the day ahead, and then that would provide time for EDAM BA entities to recalculate and release any unscheduled rights for EDAM purposes. As long as the rules are really clear that those rights can be maintained in EDAM and made inaccessible if scheduled, then I think this is one of those sticky areas that I think you could support that those scheduling rights have been respected as long as we set up the scheduling requirement. If we don't set up a scheduling requirement, then there's not the transparency and clarity on how entities that hold the transmission rights can ensure that their rights are scheduled and not made accessible to the EDAM market. That's why I think we need the pre-day ahead process. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Okay. And then can you kind of summarize what the difference is between your discussion and where we've been headed in the principles?
Sure. Can you go back? Whoever's controlling the slides, would you mind going back one slide? I think that might be a good this is a good one, I think, to land on for maybe questions too. So what we see is different here is that the third-party rights are explicitly respected. Internal transmission, as we've considered that, we've addressed it. Penalty prices in the market can ensure this priority, so we can mitigate concerns with not ensuring open access consistent with the relative priorities that those require for those that hold these rights. That's a huge thing that we can mitigate through this approach. The other thing that I think maybe is that what is different is this contemplates kind of 3 things: internal participating resources, transfers, which would be consistent, which would have the compensation treatment consistent with like a 0-cost joint dispatch agreement, and then ATC that EDAM transfers and intertie transactions would compete for. And in that ensures that we are respecting open access rules where what has been unsold, not owned, not reserved, unsold, allows for both all market participants that can submit and compete for that intertie capacity and the EDAM transfers to simultaneously compete on an equal basis, respecting open access rules. So that's a really critical piece of having the ATC as a separate additional amount of capacity above what would be eligible for transfer treatment. This is also how, and we kind of think this flows well into what the compensation is, because, you know, we talked about that at the last meeting. While we don't have an opinion on the specific type of contract compensation at this point, blended, single rate, et cetera, we've envisioned it, I believe, very similarly to how Kathy walked through it, of export. If you have the import, export, and wheels throughs, it's on the export or the wheels that the cost is assigned for access to these areas for any non-firm hourly ATC that is awarded or that is reserved through the EDAM market transactions getting awards.
Okay, all right. I'll need to think about that. Okay, we've got a few hands raised. Fred Hewitt.
Everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Hi, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Thanks. This was a helpful presentation. Question I have is on slide 11 on the idea of a competitive solicitation for transmission rights. And just observing first, although I'm not following it very closely, this is an interesting idea. And I'm wondering if that's something kind of to cross-discuss with the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. I always have trouble saying all that. The question I have is about the idea of the RC being involved in this. I'm just curious about that because my general sense has always been reliability function and market function should be kept as separate as possible. And I'm just curious what the thinking is behind that, having the RC do something on that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm looking at this slide on the screen, and I think, I'm not sure why it got messed up, but if you can go forward.
Yeah, the slide that says, the numbering must have changed.
Yeah.
I downloaded this last night.
I know.
One way to accomplish these foundational goals is at the top.
Yeah, go forward a few more slides. Well, if you don't mind. Okay, stop there. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And what was your name again? I apologize.
It's Fred Hewitt.
Fred Hewitt. Okay, it's good. So the reliability coordinator thing, see the question mark? I actually, this isn't a proposal. It's just I thought would be an opportunity to ask the question of, if we're talking about transmission competitive solicitation, that's probably a little outside the bounds of the EDAM market operator itself. And so so I think we need to talk about what would be the entity that would be best to do so. I think I had posed questions in a couple earlier meetings. Is this something that the EDAM BAAs would want to do themselves? And I think the feedback we got was no, third-party customers, third-party rights should interface with kind of an independent operator equivalent. And if you don't mind, Fred, I'll point it back to you because it's one question I have. If it's not a market operator, is it the reliability coordinator function? Is it a regional transmission planning function? Is it,
Well, my initial reaction is that if the purpose of this is to aggregate transmission in some fashion or get it committed for the purposes of EDAM, CAISO is the market operator. Competitive solicitation is a market of a type, and it seems like, however, if there's a reason to consider another entity to do that, okay, maybe. Certainly it's open for discussion, but it just, to me anyway, the RC is just not the right place for that to happen. It's not the kind of thing they do. Yes, there's a lot of information that flows back and forth between the CAISO and all the BAs and the RC, but it's for operational reliability purposes and not for any kind of market function.
No, I think that's fair. And please don't read into that as I just kind of threw that out there to see if we could spur some conversation on this point. Hey, Deb, you've mentioned the monthly process we have for TONC. Who administers that? directly?
It's a contract right for existing CRRs.
Mm-hmm.
So that would not.
It would go through the CRR group.
Well, my understanding of what you're trying to do here is you're trying to come up with a third party that
Mm-hmm.
would be able to head and facilitate transfers of transmission rights that a transmission provider, a transmission rights holder has if they want to sell off to other parties, right?
I think it just I'm posing the question, does it need to be a step removed? Does the entity that administers the solicitation need to be a step removed, or is everyone comfortable with it being a part of the CAISO operation process? So I don't, I think this is really just posing a question for everyone to think about. I could very well see the OEs doing it. I mean, I think that there's the technical capability, and there's definitely room for the CAISO to do it. I think the CAISO do we have the resources to administer this new process? Things like that need to be thought about in more detail.
Okay. Why don't we go on? We've got a number of people. So Jeff Nelson.
Thanks, Fred.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It says Jeff Nelson from SCE. Good morning. I wasn't sure what hat I was supposed to be wearing when I was hearing this. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be wearing an existing Cal ISO full participant, and there's going to be changes to the way an existing full participant does business under this proposal, or if I was only supposed to be wearing a hat that I'm an external balancing authority, and this is really talking about how that external balancing authority is going to determine what transmission it turns over to EDAM. So can you help me frame this so I'm looking at it from the right perspective?
Absolutely. And I thank you for asking the question, Jeff. Really appreciate it. I think that you're supposed to be wearing both, but you're supposed to also keep your 1 foot in transmission services and market priorities world. And then keep that in mind that they're all related, which I find mentally exhausting as well. So this is all anchored, but it gives me a chance to explain that this is all anchored in the view of the world that we have been discussing in transmission services and market priorities. The way that I think about it is that project is looking at improving the just and reasonableness of our existing framework to ensure that a lot of these, needs and concerns on the native network load side are being respected, while the priority and treatment and for the point-to-point customers are also given equitable access, so consistent with open access rules. That's something we're working on updating and reforming CAISO BAA full participant rules in light of California specific considerations, right? That's going on in this other process. But this is a proposal that is an extension of that once it's implemented. In my worldview, these are all very seamless. The updates to the forward transmission reservation process for the CISO BAA gets implemented, and the timing, I don't know if it's at the same time or if it's prior. Then the EDAM prioritization is also respected as an external, and the external entities have that respected, but they're all integrated. And this concept is something that for the CISO BAA, we've asked, we're going to have tons of time to delve into some of the details for the CISO BAA. We've asked for another meeting to give this proposal specific to the CISO BAA implementation under transmission services and market priorities. This is the extension part.
Yeah, because I hear things like network service and non-firm. That just doesn't exist in the California ISO. So I heard this presentation as this is how external balancing authorities are going to determine what they're actually able to turn over to the EIM, or I should say the EDAM. And maybe that's not what you were saying, but that's how I was hearing it. Because once it's turned over to EDAM, all those things don't exist.
Well, and in our proposal, they stay there, and that's a part of, and that is a, and just, you know,
Okay,
Jeff,
okay,
we are proposing, yeah.
yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing is that may not be how CAISO works today, but it is what we're proposing CAISO do regardless of EDAM. So again, it's mindful to keep in mind there are two different processes, deeply related, and CAISO's BAA is going this way. And so this does integrate well with it once we make those once we stakeholder that policy and bring that to the board and go through a process of approving that. That's in a separate project, unfortunately. This is just an extension of that, and these rules will apply to CAISO BAA as well, because they'll all be aligned in my great world.
Okay, I'm just having a hard time. Again, maybe I'm hearing you wrong, that you're suggesting the ISO starts using non-firm transmission and network service within its own balancing authority?
Well, what I'll do is Milos and Christina are in the process of scheduling the meeting for us to go through the proposals for how we're going to reform our existing rules in CAISO's BAA. I believe that's in early February. And I think this is not a low-level question. It is unfortunate these processes are not kind of seamlessly working the way we had hoped. So I understand your frustration. I share it. But we are getting a 2-hour meeting scheduled to go through the proposals for how these concepts would be implemented in the CAISO. I think it's early February is what we're looking for.
Milos, should you want to jump in on that?
Thank you.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. This is Milos with the ISO, and thanks, Kathleen, for the presentation. I think what Jeff was ultimately getting was a maybe more foundational question. Maybe I think the focus here, it can help us understand, how does what you're walking us through today apply in the context of the EIM entity BAs? I guess that's the perspective that you're presenting this from. Certain type of transmission, how it's turned over under an oath framework in comparison to the buckets that we heard last time. Putting aside for a second, where the ISO ultimately may go with transmission, but just to ground us on and compare the two proposals, can you help us a little bit, at least between, how does your approach here line up with the buckets approach that we heard last time?
Yeah.
I think we're talking past each other with where the ISO may go down the line. If we can, I think, separate the discussions for a little bit, at least to help ground us on what we heard last time compared to today, I think that will help us a bit here with further questions.
Sure. And one thing I want to start with is you mentioned EIM entities. So the CISO BAA is an EIM entity. So the proposal here would apply consistently across all EIM entities, including the CISO. Now, I understand that there are implementation changes that are going to be requiring the phase 2 of transmission services and market priorities to be implemented for this to be doable. And if you want to go to maybe that second to last slide before the appendix, another good place to go back to. And keep going forward. Go 3 more slides, I think. And the numbers. Perfect. Data. Okay. I hope that helps clarify for you, Milos. I do think it's really difficult to separate these things because, as you know, we're going to be providing proposals and the other effort on adding designated network resource to the CAISO's rules. So I'll just start with there as an example. And so once we do that, this will all start to make a lot of sense. So I think we need to get through the February meeting where we have a chance to work on the CAISO rules. And then we can bring it back to this group and revisit it. But the concept of this proposal and recommendation is consistent treatment of open access across the entire EDAM footprint. Can we go to the next question, please?
Callie Wells.
Hi, Kathleen. It's Callie Wells with WPTF.
Hi, Callie.
Hi. Thank you for taking your time and putting all this information out there. It's an interesting idea, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around a lot of it. But I was hoping you can elaborate a little bit more on this idea of having intertie bidding and how that would work with what we've been discussing today, which is kind of more of the EDAM transfers. I'm trying to figure out in my mind or make clear how those two work together. Do you envision them as kind of two separate scheduling points, or is more intertie additional capacity above and beyond EDAM transfers? So if you can elaborate a little bit more on that framework, I think that would be useful.
No, that sounds great. I envision it as, excuse me, you could think of it as incremental, but it's really overlapping. So it is an idea of, and this kind of get, the non-firm hourly ATC is the available transmission capacity that is available. There is above and beyond what would be the transmission associated and kind of owned by that. So I say like portions of bucket one, which is seem to be, LSE owned transmission. That I think can make sense. And I'm trying to remember which the numbers are, but the slides that were posted last night, slide 10, kind of walks through the three different categories. EDAM should allow for rights that should not be optimized. It should have the ability to remove from the total transfer capability portions that are not accessible to the market, which can be done through the EDAM, through non-firm hourly ATC calc to some extent. It can also be done through scheduling directly with the CAISO's market. The intertie bidding would be the non-firm hourly ATC above the transfer amount, which is what is the transmission owned by the LSE that is looking for the EDAM transfer treatment. Both intertie transactions and any additional EDAM transfers or that LSE could also compete for that non-firm hourly above. To give you an example in my mind, I see this as very consistent with what we do today in our real-time market for the CISO DAA. The CAISO has internal participating resources. The CAISO has access to EIM transfers, and there's also still intertie bidding that's allowed simultaneously. So as far as like a functionality, if you think about it like that, there's different offers that can be submitted. They can compete, and the one that is most economic can be subscribed. And that's where the penalty prices come in. They're super important. If you pre-scheduled that priority, if you self-schedule, you should have higher priority to accessing that available transmission capacity consistent with those reservation products that you have previously reserved. Does that help at all? I also, stop.
Yes, yeah, that does. I think framing it as similar to how the CAISO has those two today makes sense. And I think that early February meeting will also be helpful to kind of tie it all together. Yes, I'm still thinking through it, but yes, that did help. Thank you.
No, that sounds great. And I should, this is at a conceptual level, as you can tell. I mean, there's some details in here, but there's still a conceptual detail level. And if there's traction and interest in the stakeholder group of working through some of these details, we will put together some examples. And we just didn't have time to kind of get to that level of detail here.
Okay. Jeff, Spires.
Hi, good morning. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thanks, Kathleen, for the detailed presentation. And like Callie said, there's lots to think about here. I just wanted to give some feedback on a couple of topics. The first one is the idea of a pre-scheduling requirement. And I think you also sort of characterized it as non-participating resource base points. And I think another way to kind of maybe just at a higher level is the concept of day-ahead base schedules, essentially. And, I know that so far the CAISO hasn't wanted to go down that road as far as allowing base schedules to be submitted before the EDAM, but I think, there's been a number of discussions over the last couple of weeks around the challenges of, how do you honor the out scheduling rights that people have and support that framework if you don't have a mechanism for submitting physical schedules. And so I think from our perspective, we think that some variation of this is going to be necessary, whether it's, 2 days ahead, or maybe you could do it sooner and it could be done right before the EDAM runs, but some kind of ability to base schedule in advance to provide the market with the information about who's using their out rights, making sure that those out rights are properly physically respected, and finding a way to maintain that connection between somebody who has, say, a resource and a load and is trying to physically schedule on their transmission. How do they do that without something like this? So I think, at a high level, in terms of just conceptually, I think we agree with that concept. And of course, there's details there, but I just wanted to give you that feedback. The other sort of category that it was more of a question is around your starting point for EDAM transfers, that essentially they're non-firm ATC, and an element of that would be that unscheduled rights would then potentially be part of that calculation and used to produce a day-ahead solution. And I think the tension we see in that approach is with how do you then be sure that you can rely on that outcome, particularly if you have entities that are trying to decommit resources and get some of the unit commitment benefits from a day-ahead solution, but ultimately relying on a non-firm transfer to displace that resource. And I think that sort of ties back to one of the thoughts around the buckets discussion. As an example, bucket 2, if a firm point-to-point rights holder wanted to put that transmission in and donate it into the market, and no longer would they have the right to use that physically, they'd be making it available to the market. Do you see a barrier to allowing that to be scheduled through the EDAM as a firm transfer? Because that was kind of one of the benefits of thinking of it that way, is that you could, put the transmission in and maintain that firm priority so that you had a more reliable outcome.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a great question. And this deck was put together very quickly, so it's not it's lacking some detail, and this is a good one to pull out. So our vision is that let's say the process for competitive solicitation and/or the process for releasing it gets set up, and that happens kind of in a more advanced time frame. Let's say T-2 to keep it simple. I think that's the closest one we've been proposing. So you release those transmission rights, get compensated for it in some way, shape, or form. That would be in the fourth bucket here, or I'm going to call them buckets. The fourth bucket the third bucket, priority 4. And this is part of what we put in here, and I think that this is probably the nuance, is that our current thinking is that the EDAM transfers, especially if we're going to respect firm point-to-point rights, and that it's just not consistent with open access. And there's a lot to discuss about this one, but I think that it gets into that, yes, we want to open we want to unlock transmission capacity or free up transmission capacity for purpose of the EDAM transfer, which could be what's released in addition or resold, et cetera, would be released into this kind of third level for priority 4, and be given the equivalent of secondary network service. So all we're trying to differentiate is it's given a higher priority, but the higher priority is subservient to that given to the non-participating resources, which are equivalent for the designated network resources, right? That gets a higher priority than the transfers. And firm point-to-point transmission service and firm point-to-point and intertie transactions that have the firm rights gets a higher priority than the EDAM transfers from this freed up capacity. But all of that is a higher priority than the non-firm point-to-point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I probably have some follow-up questions, and there's a few things, obviously there's details there, but I guess just in trying to understand where EDAM transfers might fit in, it seems like the concept of a point-to-point rights holder that's already arranged for firm service and bought that, wanting to, instead of using it for their own transactions, make it available to the market,
Mhm.
and it's a higher quality. It seems like that's a beneficial outcome just because now you've got more transmission, but also more transmission that's firm, and wanting to be able to try to find a way to make sure that that is the benefits of that are reflected in the optimization, so that when you have these transactions, the different entities and different BAs feel like they can rely on that dispatch. So anyhow, I appreciate the response.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing is that we kind of see that the bucket 2 is unnecessary because it's either released or it's not. And if it's not, it's held out of the market. If it's released, then it would be opened up for transfers. Yeah, next question.
Doug Boccioni.
Hi, this is Doug Boccioni. I'm representing the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Just a couple of comments. I think some of the what Jeff Nelson brought up is sort of reflective of the fact that this approach is quite a bit different from what was chosen for providing open access when CAISO's markets were formed. And, they took a very different approach to honoring existing contracts and transmission ownership rights than I think what you have in mind here. So I think that's some of the, it's going to take a while for us to wrap our minds around what you're proposing. What the PTOs did and the CAISO tariff did for the existing rights holders was allow those parties to schedule on their rights using self schedules and then all the way through real time. And then, if the market had to be redispatched to honor that self schedule, that's what happened. So there, the CAISO had a process for honoring those rights. And I think what you're describing is a very different approach, one that wasn't implemented. And so, if we're going to go down this path, I think it's going to require kind of a rethink of how CAISO does things. And I guess one thing that kind of jumps out at me, I'm a little concerned about when you talk about, having both intertie scheduling rights and the overall, optimization. It just reminds me of the phantom congestion problem that we had for a period of time in the CAISO. And it seems like this could potentially sort of resurrect and create similar problems. And I just worry a little bit that, I think there's ways to address some of these issues, and CAISO did implement ways to address it, but it just seems like there's the potential for it to be less efficient. We know there's loop flow. We know that with the intertie schedules, we're pretending that contract paths can work. And I just worry that, within the CAISO footprint, we feel pretty confident that we get an efficient dispatch. And I worry that if in trying to go down this path of respecting the sort of the approach, we might be inviting some inefficiencies that could be avoided by extending the concepts that have been implemented within the CAISO footprint to the EDAM BAAs rather than going the other way around.
And Doug, I really appreciate your comments. I feel like I do like advertisements for myself and have these meetings, but I also really agree this takes time to think through. We've had our proposal for the CISO BA out, at least an initial one that we're going to update since July. We hope everyone has hopefully checked it out because I mentioned it a few times. And I think it's really important. There's a few things. The way that CAISO is set up, its process was really specific to the timeline when it was put together, and that there was sufficient capacity on the ties and through the system in order for it to be less restrictive. Another thing I noticed, our proposal is extremely consistent from an implementation perspective with what you were mentioning about the scheduling of the existing contracts. ETC's TORs, I didn't comment on here, but it would be the same or higher than priority 5. I can add those if that would help. Grandfather rights would, of course, be very high. And the rest of this is implementing it the same way through cell schedules, just with different priorities assigned to them, consistent with what the upfront investment was put towards those transactions, if any has been done. And I just want to encourage everyone that while it may feel like we're moving away from some efficiencies in CAISO, that's really a transmission services and market priority conversation that we're going to have, that we have been having about making this transition to better incorporate OAK concepts, to better respect these firm rights and these other rights, non-firm rights that have a higher priority access at the ties and through the system. That's an open problem. That's also a commitment to address. So this is something that we are dealing with in CAISO. And we can't forget that we've got to design that. And we do have to design that first and then see if there's any kind of tweaks or adjustments. But really, once we get that framework set up for CAISO BAA to be supporting more open access approach to the CAISO system, I think the efficiency thing is a good thing to bring up, but we have an open issue that there's concerns with the open access of the current rules. And so we need to address that and just be open-minded to it. And this is just an extension of that proposal.
Okay. Partha, you have your hand up next.
Yep, thanks, Debbie. This is Partha Malvadkar with the California ISO policy staff. And this is probably a very, thanks, Kathleen. This is a really helpful presentation. I was just really trying to understand sort of, and this might be really a follow-up to what you were just discussing with Doug as well with Jeff Spires. Like, how much of your objective when you're talking about sort of the open access principles and some of the concerns boils down to the ability for other parties to get financial rights or sort of collect the congestion associated with those versus how much of this is sort of the ability to have physical rights and potentially hold firm service from being dispatched to the market. I was just trying to understand sort of what the scope of the concern was on your part.
Yeah, and thanks, Partha, for asking that question. I can't speak for everyone. I can't say that the financial rights hasn't occurred to others. I will only speak for myself. And since I was kind of the author of this, I will say that I'm focused on the latter, the ability to respect the physical rights that have been reserved and ensure that we are integrating EDAM with that framework so that we can ensure that open access can be supported. We can support in any filing that this is not undermining open access. It's complementing, it's improving it.
Okay, that's helpful. So in effect, when you're talking about these rights holders and basically the release of transmission from the undesignation process, you're really talking about the ability for third parties to access that transmission and basically be able to have the physical rights associated with it. Am I understanding it correctly?
That is, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate that clarity.
Yeah, of course.
Kevin Smith.
Hey, Kevin Smith Bank. So I actually almost put my hand back down because I think we've kind of circled Partha, came back to it a little bit, but I'm trying to understand a comment going back to what Jeff had asked about bucket 2. And I don't understand how kind of the concepts that have been put out there are inconsistent with open access. You have a firm point-to-point right, and you make a choice, and however the mechanism is handled, they make a choice to make that available. And you could go back to how the tank process would work today, but that point-to-point firm right is made available. And then you can talk about the details, whether the CAISO can dispatch, if it's not made available, redispatch if it's not made available and still flow over that line. But assuming that, leaving that's a secondary question. How is the ability of a third-party transmission customer that owns or has rights on a point-to-point right, firm transmission, and they want to make it available? I don't understand how that would be inconsistent or why that would have some different priority. It's a firm right. And maybe I misunderstood something, Kathleen.
No, that's fine. And maybe I can get, in talking to folks offline, it has occurred to me that, I do think there's probably something that is a policy piece that maybe has a different interpretation that we're putting forward that isn't in the current one. And it'd be great to kind of figure out what those are, because that's one of the things I've been struggling with. But I think generally speaking, I think this is the how to do the general principles of the buckets. My view of the world is that the buckets are kind of overcomplicating it. Like, for instance, I think all of these, and maybe this will be an example that would help, is that what is resource sufficiency? We've been spending a lot of time talking about. I don't view the transfer limit as really being necessary to factor into resource sufficiency. If we define resource sufficiency as there's, let's say, sufficient bid range capacity made available to serve that internal area needs, well, then that can come from imports, as long as the net import. So net import capability is important, but that's from all of these things. It's not from some portion made available. It's from all the resources that offer into EDAM, whether it is being offered in as an intertie or whether it's being offered as a participating or a non-participating resource within the internal areas. If it can serve that load, so import into that area or internal, then it should count. And whether that's third party or that's utility owned, it should count. The transmission itself, I don't think we should be making a test for. So I think to some extent, it's not so much that I'm saying that a bucket or this and that. Like, I could go through and say, here are my concerns with open access if my assumption about how you'd implement it is accurate, but we haven't gotten to that implementation detail. So I don't want to go that far. I want to say that this is a how that we could implement what we've been talking about in a way that would respect open access. And I think that if we unlock the way we think about EDAM, which I also just want to reemphasize, like, we haven't had a chance to talk through like the core fundamentals of what EDAM has. So I don't even know if there's consensus that intertie bidding should be able to, that intertie marketers should be able to compete and provide the kind of value that we're saying that they can provide, right? As well as internal third-party generators, they can provide value to EDAM. These are just hows and additional details to improve kind of the overall, that would increase benefits out of EDAM. But I wanted to give the example of RSC. I don't think we need to get locked into, here's a bucket, here's how it's used. No, here's our transmission. That's great. Now we know how we're going to use the transmission against the transactions. Let's pivot and then focus on the other topics and do those in a mindful way, but not get trapped into the idea that there's a relationship between transfers versus ATC only counting towards RSC.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I just go back. I think it's kind of the opposite to me. The buckets are, frankly, we'll call it simplistic view. They're the forest looking down, and then we're getting into the individual trees, implementation details, which we all acknowledge we need to get to. Issues of intertie bidding, we haven't completed our, and you've kind of helped to point those issues out, but we hadn't really come to any absolute conclusions. I think it's all subject to debate. But I do think that the bucket concepts, again, they're intended to just loosely group how, an EDAM entity looks at its transmission and how this would be made available generally to the market to provide the most open and liquid way to, approach the market. And so that we never intended it to be in this level of detail I think, we're getting into, but I really do appreciate that. But I still think that generally the buckets kind of hit the high points of the various types of transmission. And I'll just leave it at that. But I do appreciate it, Kathleen. Thank you.
You're welcome, Kevin. And I'll just say devil's in the details. It's kind of like my call sign. So, and I also want to just flag and are there more questions, Deb, or should I wrap up? Sorry.
Well, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Fred, okay, never mind. Milos has one more thought.
Okay.
Hey, Kathleen. Yeah,
hey.
So, all right. It looks like I'm unmuted. So just wanted to, again, in the effort of helping tease out for folks the difference between what you presented and the buckets concept. As I understand it, sounds like under your approach here that you're putting forward, the ISO itself would need to move to an OAK transmission-based reservation framework for parity and how transmission is made available. I'll just note that, like you said, we're discussing that in the other initiative, but I think we're not necessarily inclined to think that that's necessarily where we need to go. We think the issue is a bit narrower, and we'll discuss it in that initiative. But we think it can also work with the current framework, which has been approved by FERC as to how the ISO provides open access to its system. The second aspect here that I just want to tease out is you're also suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I think Jeff got to this, Jeff Spires, that certain types of low priority non-firm transmission can also support EDAM transfers. It's just that if it is used, it would have lower priority than other types of transactions, which I think is, at least on its face, counter initially to the principle that we're looking to provide certainty and dependability to EDAM transfers. So I just want to, on that second point in particular, just to make sure I understand, you're suggesting that there could be other types of transmission other than firm, conditional firm, or this concept that the buckets allude to, otherwise highly reliable type of transmission that could support EDAM transfers that would have lower priority than potentially higher other types of transactions. Is that right?
Yeah, and maybe the simple way to look at it is the bottom two rows. The bottom row, if we only are thinking about internal resources, is the non-participating that has a higher priority. The priority 4 has a lower priority on the cell schedule than those non-participating base points, which I think is really consistent with how we currently treat EIM. I just want to flag that. And I mean, a base point is different than a base schedule is different than self schedule, right? Like, and when we have different types of priorities for self schedules. So all of these concepts are things that we have. And I also want to note secondary network service is something understood and respected in the OAT for off-system sales to serve your internal load. It's given the equivalent of secondary network service, and it does have a slightly lower priority than your designated network resources, and there are reasons for that. And I think that what we're proposing, or what I'm putting forward here, and what we haven't really been talking about is what is EDAM? What are the different, and so what we've done is separated the transactions and said the transfers, which I think you generally could think of as in either the green or the yellow. It depends. Base points have a higher scheduling priority than participating resources that are self-scheduled. Firm self-schedules have consistent priority with the non-participating base points. That kind of implementation aligns with open access requirements. And I just want to emphasize that secondary network service is a higher priority than all of these other items above. And so it is still a secure service that entities use when economy energy sales are preferred or more economic relative to serving it from a DNR. So I don't think that these are unknown concepts. were inconsistent with our goals in EDAM.
Okay,
Okay.
last question from Jan Strack.
Howdy. First of all, Kathleen, thank you for taking the time to put this together. And I really don't need you to respond at all. I'm just going to make a comment here.
Okay.
I'm not interested, and I would not recommend that our company support the direction you're going here. This to me looks like trying to make the bilateral markets more efficient. That's not what we're interested in with EDAM. It also seems to me that you're transferring the responsibility for other parties' ability to honor their own tariffs over to the EDAM market operator, which I don't think is appropriate. So I just wanted to sort of put a little stake in the ground from my perspective, at least, and it kind of follows on what Jeff Nelson and Doug Bocciani were saying. I don't think this is going in the right direction. And I don't think the ISO should really pursue this as part of the EDAM proposal. Thank you.
No, thank you. Jen, do you mind repeating what organization you're with?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm with San Diego Gas and Electric.
Thank you.
Okay. Any final comments, Kathleen, before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everyone and the CAISO for the opportunity to present. We've been spending quite a bit of time over the last year thinking through these challenges and concepts for both the CAISO and other areas as it applies to the EDAM. We are really open to feedback, and I just encourage anyone that is on the call and interested and wants to kind of share with us some more, more detailed feedback or suggestions, please reach out to me. I may not have included my email, but it's my first name, period, last name @districtcorp.com. And just reach out and I'm happy to talk with you and would love to take into consideration feedback. That's it. Thank you, Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. If we could go ahead and...
Oh, Debbie, can I make one more plug? I'm sorry, I should have said this, I forgot to.
Sure.
I did want to note we have an appendix at the back. This is a deck that we presented at, I think, the first Transmission Services and Market Priorities Working Group 1 meeting. It's got background on open access rules. If you're not super agile with the language and the concepts, it's just a really good primer. And so I included it as an appendix just as a benefit for the group and encourage you to look at it. It's got a lot of really good context. But yeah, thank you again. Sorry.
Not a problem. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and if the event producer could go ahead and take down this presentation, and then I would like to go ahead and if you could give sharing rights to me. Make this bigger for everybody. Hold on 2 seconds. Trying to get this thing organized. Okay, there we go. All right. So this is back to the list of scope items for consideration. And excuse the background noise. The Bernese Mountain Dog is very thirsty at the moment. So Kathleen, you commented a couple of times that we haven't really talked about what EDAM is and how it's going to work. Just to focus everybody, the intention is that EDAM is just extending the existing day-ahead market to allow the EIM entities to now participate in the extended day-ahead market. And we would go ahead and optimize based on the additional EIM entities that want to participate in the day-ahead market. I think that for discussion purposes, we've already stated a number of times that we need bucket one to go ahead and connect for resource efficiency obligations, the load and the resource, and then the transmission in between. So that's why we need bucket one. I think that bucket two does go ahead and already takes care of the firm point-to-point transmission that was a concern that was raised in Kathleen's presentation, and along with the network transmission. I think we need to get into more of a discussion with respect to whether the third-party entity that's holding the transmission makes it available or doesn't make it available, and how that is protected from not being used in the market and able to be used later. And then lastly, bucket three, the ATC, which is the unsold transmission and or transmission that an entity has that wants to go ahead and offer their transmission up because they're not going to be using it. The concern that I would have with adding in non-firm transmission is in the day-ahead market, you're now sitting at least 12, 14 hours out before the actual trading day, and what you have available for transmission is going to change over time. So I think, in my mind, non-firm transmission is much better suited for the real-time market versus the extended day-ahead market. What we've heard across the board from everyone that is contemplating participating in the extended day-ahead market is they want assurances that that transmission is going to go ahead and be there when the day-ahead market does run. And so if it's non-firm transmission, that sets the stage to begin with that there's a high potential that it's not going to be available in the day-ahead market. So I think that what I'd like to do is go ahead and let's have more of a discussion about what is in the bucket, how we can take the concepts that Kathleen believes are missing from the day ahead and add them in, and then see if we've actually answered some of these questions. You know, what are the purposes of the bucket? What transmission is made available? Talk a little bit more about the internal transmission, point-to-point transmission that an entity holds versus the network transmission, and how that transmission is made available, and see if we can tick off whether we've answered these questions and we can blow this out. I do have George Angelides teed up for a discussion for Thursday to talk a little bit more about self-scheduling and how the transmission, how the market would view the transmission to be used in the optimization, whereas if someone wants to go ahead and sell off their transmission, they have the ability to do that. So with the last 20 minutes that we have for this meeting, does anyone have any concerns with that type of a discussion or have different ideas as to what we should be discussing? And I'll pause to allow people to raise their hands. Okay, seeing no raised hands. So the whole idea behind bucket one, let me see if I can increase the size on this for everyone. The whole idea behind bucket one is specifically for the resource efficiency is why it's needed. And it would be transmission that is mandatory to be put in, if you're an EDAM entity, to be put into the market. And we need that correlation so that we can go ahead and ensure that the load and the resource, there's transmission for those two to be tied together so that the load is served in order to meet the resource efficiency. So does anyone have a concern with that need and that requirement? Kathleen?
Sure, I'll just, this is Kathleen Goldberg from Vista. Maybe I can share my, and I think I alluded to this, but I don't believe that we need to identify necessarily a bucket for resource efficiency purposes. I think we need to know what the internal transmission capacity is. It needs to be modeled in the market, the full network model. And we need to know what the net import capability is for counting imports. But the resource efficiency test is really not a transmission test. And I think that's been one of the challenges in that space. But we also don't really test for deliverability for bid range. Remember, it's a liquidity test. Do you have enough offers that could be dispatched to meet the needs? We don't do a lot of deliverability checks. I do think this conflates with the other working group, but perhaps let us, if the CAISO can do that in these working groups, let's focus in RSC's working group on what we all believe it should be doing and how it should be doing it, which we're working on there. Once we do that, decisions like I'm saying, if our worldview is, or some version of it that includes imports and doesn't believe that there's a deliverability check needed on all of those resources, then we don't need to do this. The other thing that we don't need to tie the transmission to it is all I'm saying.
Kathleen, what we're saying is the ISO requires this for EDAM. That's what we're saying right now.
I think that
to the extent the RSC group comes out with a different determination, what the CAISO is saying right now is that we need a ability to have transmission that ties the load with the resource to determine the resource efficiency, and that would be have a special marker on it that this transmission is for resource efficiency. That's what the ISO needs.
And so, Debbie, I think that is separate from resource efficiency, and we've noted this. If I believe that there is a conflation, and that what the CAISO is asking for is a transmission sufficiency test, I do not object to raising a discussion on a transmission sufficiency test, but I do have concerns with conflating it with RSC. And I think it adds to confusion. So if that's what we're looking to do, is transmission sufficiency test, then it's probably best in this working group to define what that looks like.
George, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. Of course, the resource sufficiency evaluation topic is an item discussed in the working group 1, but since the discussion has ensued here, I would like to provide some clarification on the needs and what led us to this bucket 1 transmission that we're talking about. And there is a difference here in EDAM compared to the energy imbalance market, which led to the need for the bucket 1 transmission that we're all talking about. And I want to clarify again that in this discussion about bucket 1, we are referring to intertie transmission across BAAs. The resource efficiency evaluation test is a test for the BAA. So internal transmission is not looked upon, particularly in terms of deliverability, as we discussed earlier. It's a screen, it's not an optimization, so we assume all internal transmission is available and it's not encumbered for the purpose of the test, of course. So the difference with EIM is the following. In EIM, all transmission is made available free, right? So it can be used by any BAA in EIM participating. And for this reason, we take the concept of diversity and we pro rata distribute it to every BAA. We say everybody gets a piece of it since they're part of the EIM with free transmission. In EDAM, it's a little different. We don't have this concept of completely free transmission. We differentiate about the transmission products, and we wanted to, instead of socialize the concept of diversity, we actually wanted to provide a mechanism to have a product for it, saying that if one BAA has surplus in say flexibility or capacity, they can trade some of that with contracts or arrangements to another BAA for the purpose of supporting that BAA in the resource efficiency evaluation. And that led to the concept of the bucket one transfer, which is transmission between BAAs that is declared in advance, is designated for the use of products that can be used to essentially transfer capacity requirements from one BA to another for the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation. This is what basically led to the bucket one transmission that we're all talking about here, and it's a concept that you see in EDAM, you don't see it in EIM, because there all this diversity is socialized. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Okay, moving on to bucket number 2. So bucket number 2, we have at the moment that it is a voluntarily made available for congestion rents. And congestion rents in this context is the marginal cost of congestion between the 2 points of delivery and the resource. So unscheduled firm point to point would be in this bucket. The MARC would only be allowed to use unscheduled firm to firm to the extent that the provider doesn't have it reserved, or the entity would go ahead and not need it, and they could go ahead and make it available to the transmission customer. At this point, the discussion is no incremental transmission charge because it's already been paid for. The transmission existing rights holder has already paid for the transmission, so there shouldn't be a transmission charge for it, and they'll get the congestion revenue from the LMP price. And to the extent that the transmission provider has extra point-to-point available across the transfer capability, the transfer points between the BAs, then they get, that's what's being offered to the entities for that. So the concept of transmission made available versus transmission not available and needs to be protected. That's what we're going to go ahead and talk about on Thursday, so I don't want to get into that. But are there any other details? I want to make sure that we kind of capture all of the concerns with transmission that has already been sold, especially to an entity, to make sure that we're talking about all of their concerns with what happens to their transmission in the EDAM market. Jeff, did you want to add something to that?
There's this, that print's tiny, so forgive me if it's in here and I just didn't get to it. But we had discussed a concept of, it's Jeff Nelson, I see, of maybe if the person has sort of let it go unused, to let the market dispatch with it. And then if they were to exercise their rights later in the day or later or closer to delivery, to sort of redispatch around it. Is that concept in here, or where do we have that discussion? Because I think that's what we do with ETCs today.
That is what we do with ETCs today, and I think it's in here.
Oh, so let me just part, very last, under consideration whether we should do that. Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that would kind of change I'll say the burden of proof for allowing the market to utilize and getting compensation. That unless you opted out, the market would be using it. So I just think it's important to have that discussion.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I see it now.
Kathleen?
Yeah, no, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from District. I just talked a lot about how you would differentiate things that are within bucket 2 and put them in different, the ones released kind of in bucket 1, if that's the transfers, and then the ones scheduled as held back, and then the ones unscheduled as released through kind of, and then going with the bucket 3. So I would just note that I do think that there's some slicing and dicing here and separations that those pre-processes would address. But I also, and I can talk about it in more detail at the next meeting and kind of revisit. But I did want to note that Jeff brought up a great question and I wanted to highlight that, what I just walked through does have that concept of if it's unscheduled, it gets released through the ATC, and intertie transactions and EDAM entities could compete on an equal basis for that available transmission capacity that's unsold, and then pay any charges needed for export on the export leg. And I agree with Jeff. I think it's important to consider as a part of this market construct.
Right. Right. Yeah, and Kathleen, I think I've got the, transmission made available, transmission not made available are the other two concepts that you had. The ATC is down in bucket 3. So I think I've got all the concepts that you had in your presentation already included in this discussion. And then for bucket 3, this is in essence what's still unsold in OASIS that the EDAM entity has available that they could then make available for the day-ahead market. And to the extent that it's not sold in the day-ahead market, then it would go ahead and be available back to the transmission provider to then resell in OASIS once the EDAM had run and they know that it's still available for sale. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and I'll post these notes so that everybody has a copy of it. I had planned on cleaning them up so it's a little bit easier to read, but I'll go ahead and post these for discussions for Thursday, and then we'll have George give a presentation on how to go ahead and protect the transmission for the existing rights holders, similar to along the lines of what we have for ETCs and TORs. And I see we have a question from Tom Wu. Tom? You're still muted. There you go.
Yeah, am I muted?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
WAPA. WAPA has transmission rights on PECI and COTP. So I don't know what it means here unless opt-out market would be using it. Does that mean if WAPA does not use PECI and COTP, all of a sudden the capacity will be automatically made available for EDAM?
So what ends up happening for existing contracts, which is what your PECI and COTP rights are, is you'll get a contract reference number for those, and you'll schedule that in the day-ahead market so that those rights are then used or set aside for you, and you can adjust that in the real-time market. But George will go into that in more detail on Thursday.
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping that, you know, the market would have a mechanism, you know, for people to voluntarily bid that capacity to the market instead of being just used without, you know, compensation.
Yes, they can. That's part of what Bucket 2 does, is you would have the ability to as the right holder, you'd have the ability to put that into the market and then get the transmission congestion. Well, the cost recovery at the moment is through the existing OAT, but you would get cost recovery for that in the Bucket 2. But George will go into that in more detail on Thursday.
Okay. All right. We'll all wait for Thursday's discussion. Thanks.
Okay. Kathleen?
Hi, great. Thanks, Deb. I just want to respond to Tom. Tom, thanks for the question. Just to kind of highlight and connect the dots back to what kind of we're proposing. We're proposing that this be done through that competitive solicitation process. So you could opt to bid it, the transmission capacity out if you wanted on a weekly basis if you wanted, or wait until that T-2 and offer it in. And if competitive would get paid for releasing that transmission, and that would then be released for EDAM transfer purposes. And that's the competitive solicitation process prior is kind of where we were thinking, so that we can ensure that it gets released into the EDAM and you're compensated consistent with what your value is for that. But just to connect the dots for you.
And I would just note that the CAISO does have bids and schedules that can go in 7 days in advance. So in order to achieve what Kathleen just noted, we already have that functionality. You can go ahead and put that in your schedules and bids up to 7 days in advance already. Steve, real quickly, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. I just want to tee up maybe a discussion or a point for George for Thursday. And I apologize, I'm a little confused on just kind of the translation between Bucket 1 and kind of the, you know, bubbles and straws between BAAs, the kind of the EIM construct today versus what's going to be utilized in the EDAM from a full network model perspective, and just kind of those ebbs and flows of Bucket 1, Bucket 2, how they fit into that. Is it only impacting the straws between BAAs, or is it a more comprehensive, extended full network model? So obviously no time today, but just if George can just draw those distinctions, I just want to better understand that.
Okay. It is a full network model for EDAM, but for the resource efficiency, it's the straws, is my understanding, but George can go into that more, just to make sure that there's sufficient transmission across the different BAs to the extent that the resources in one BA and the loads in the other for the resource efficiency.
Thanks, Deb. And that's kind of how I understood it. And then, so kind of a natural second question or follow up to that for George, once again, is just, does that create kind of some disconnect where you're evaluating TTC on a bubble and straw type of basis as far as one thing, but then transitioning to a more intricate and detailed and representative full network model. But we'll talk about it Thursday. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Greatly appreciate your participation in the discussion today, and very much appreciate Kathleen putting the presentation together and getting her concepts out there so that we have a better idea of where she's coming from, and look forward to having the discussion on Thursday. And with that, everybody have a great day, and we'll talk to you on Thursday.